This is Algebra 1, Lesson 19b, Powers of Negative Numbers. We're going to do examples 19.1 and 19.2. Your book says that when a positive number is raised to a positive power, we know they mean exponent, the result is always a positive number. So let's look at some examples. Here's the first one. 3 to the second power. You will often hear that said as 3 squared, okay? Because I'll show you a little y here. If you had a square whose side is length 3, its area would be equal to 3 times 3, which is 9, and that could be written with an exponent. That's why we call it squared, okay? So, they're not teaching you that right here. 3 squared, or 3 to the second power, would be 3 times 3, and that would equal 9. 3 is the base here. Let's look at this one. 3 is also the base, but this time the exponent is 3, so we have 3 of them. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27. So that's your answer there. Oftentimes you will hear a third power, an exponent of 3, as a cube. And here's why. If you have a cube whose sides are 3, then its volume, up here I was doing area, here I'm going to talk about volume. Its volume would be 3 times 3 times 3, which is 3 to the third power, which is 27. So we often call that cubed. So I'll write those here in case you aren't familiar with those. But that's what we call, if it's to the second power, we say squared. To the third power, we say cubed. Or you can just say 3 to the third. For C, 3 to the fourth, the base is 3, and we're going to be multiplying it a total of 4 factors. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, times 3 is 81. And we don't have a special name for a fourth. D is a little bit tricky, and they tell you in the book we must be careful here. The base is still 3 here. This base of this exponent is 3. That negative that you see is not part of the base. If they wanted it to be part of the base, they would have written it like this. That would mean negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. But they did not write it that way. So they mean the opposite of 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. Now this is very important to understand. The base here is 3 and the exponent is 4. So this would just mean the opposite here, my highlighter, the opposite of what we got in C, right? So that would be the opposite of 81, or negative 81. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, times 3 is 81, and then you take the opposite. So here, that negative symbol, or subtract, means opposite. And we're not thinking about it as negative here. When a negative number is raised to an even power, the result is always positive. You can think about that. We know, we've already learned that when we multiply 2 negative numbers, we're going to get a positive result. But if we have 3 negative numbers, we're going to get a negative result. And that's why this holds true. When a negative number is raised to an even power, you're going to get a positive result. And when a negative number is raised to an odd power, you're going to get a negative result. So let's look at some examples here. Here, my base is negative 3. And it's being multiplied times itself, a total of 2 factors. Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. Here my base is negative 3, so I'm looking at the parentheses to know what the base is. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, And I have 3, an odd number of negatives, so my answer is going to be negative. For C, -3 is my base because they have it in parentheses right next to the exponent. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, times 3 is 81. And I have an even number of negatives, so it's positive. This is tricky. They keep putting their trickies last, don't they? We need to be careful here. Let's just deal with this, okay, which is exactly the same as what we just did. So we can simplify that as saying, let's bring that down, okay, or I'll bring it over, negative or opposite of what we got earlier. So the answer here is the opposite of 81, which is -81. So if you hadn't already worked that out, you would do this first, and you would say -3 times -3 times -3 times -3, but then I want the opposite of that answer. So we would know then we would do this, and our answer would be -81.